Here at the Manning Conference, Margaret Somerville beside me, a woman I've interviewed many times. We've actually written for the same publication in Mercatornet as well over the years. I want to ask you about this push for euthanasia, assisted suicide in Canada. We've had the Supreme Court decision, but that's not the only ball in play right now. You live in Montreal. Quebec is pushing forward with its own law, while MPs in Parliament try and figure out what they're going to do to respond to the court. Is Quebec actively engaged in allowing or having doctors perform euthanasia?
Yeah, well, Quebec has passed this end-of-life bill, care at the end of life, and it's due to come into effect on I think it's the 10th of December. And that would allow euthanasia. And you've got to be very clear what euthanasia is. It's a doctor giving a lethal injection to a patient. It's doubtful whether that bill allows assisted suicide because the reports on which it was based all rejected it. And the Quebec legislative hearings, a very small percentage of people agreed with assisted suicide. I think it was like...
Okay, so explain the difference, because they're quite often used interchangeably, but they're not.
No, it causes, well, they raise the same ethical problems, but they're not the same act. In euthanasia, you've really got first-degree murder legalized, and in assisted suicide, we did have the prohibition on assisted suicide, but the Supreme Court has just struck that down.
Okay, so how does that differ from euthanasia?
Well, with assisted suicide, the doctor prescribes a drug, meaning it to be taken by the patient to kill themselves. So it's somebody who commits sui, means myself-side killing. I kill myself in suicide, but the doctor helps me by giving me the means to do it. Euthanasia, as for example in Belgium and the Netherlands, the doctor comes in with a nice steel tray with a lethal injection on it, and he sticks it into your brain and poof, you're dead.
So help me out with this. I'm not a fan of euthanasia. I'm not a fan of assisted suicide. No. But the fact is, we don't allow murderers to get a lethal injection in Canada. That is described as cruel and unusual. In the United States, where this debate is playing out as well, they are saying there's a push to ban capital punishment using lethal injection, saying this is cruel and unusual. And yet we're going to say, you know what, Granny's not well, let's give her a needle and put her to sleep.
Well, the distinction that's made there by the people who want this legalized is that in capital punishment, you haven't got the person consenting. They don't want their life to be taken, or we assume, although there's recently been a case in Belgium where a prisoner did get euthanasia because he said the imprisonment was cruel and unusual treatment, and he therefore said he was suffering, therefore is entitled to euthanasia. Subsequent to that, my understanding is that about 5 prisoners applied for euthanasia, and the Attorney General stepped in and said, no, we're not going to kill off prisoners in that way. So the distinction is that you've given your consent, you're suffering, you want this. And what is very obvious in the Supreme Court of Canada judgment is there's a huge focus on suffering is the most evil thing of all. Therefore, anything that you do that relieves suffering is a lesser evil, even if it's something that raises...
Part of the reason that there's suffering is that we don't have proper end-of-life care. We don't have palliative care in Canada.
Well, we do, but we haven't got it for everybody.
It's struggling. And you know, having gone through this with my father, I can tell you that palliative care can look after the needs and the suffering and make someone comfortable.
Well, the other thing about this is that, you know, if you're going to get an informed consent to euthanasia, which the Supreme Court said you had to get, one of the requirements for informed consent is that the person be offered all other reasonably indicated treatments. So one of the issues where, you know, they might not be able to do euthanasia is unless everybody who wants euthanasia gets offered fully adequate palliative care, including, very importantly, totally adequate adequate pain management, then they can't give an informed consent to euthanasia. So that might be one way in which it would be restricted. But do you know, Brian, can I just tell you, because I've just been in Australia and I've got a 93-year-old aunt, and you know, these personal experiences, and I'm sort of somebody who goes around the world talking about how everyone's got a fundamental human right to proper pain management. My 93-year-old aunt was screaming and crying in pain, and we couldn't get anybody to do anything about it. This is just a few weeks ago. I happen to be a close personal friend of the head of the Palliative Care Council of Australia, and so I finally, because I don't like to use these favours, I went in and I said, look, we've got to do something about this. Within an hour, my aunt's pain was completely relieved. But how many people can go around doing that? And that's
not what most of us can do.
That's a tragedy, and it's wrong.
That's
discrimination.
Let me end with this, Margot, and that is, what should Parliament be doing? MPs opposed to assisted suicide say there's not enough time to craft a proper response, and others are saying let it just go. What do you say?
Well, I wrote to the Minister of Justice, Peter MacKay, and I asked him to either use the notwithstanding clause or to use it and get an extension on the time that the court is given, or to set up a royal commission and use an extension for the commission to report. But you know, it's a tragedy what's happened here, because in the Quebec reports, in the Royal Society report, and in the Supreme Court of Canada, they have relied on evidence that is, with respect, not correct. They've just sort of tossed off that this can be controlled if we legalise it. It can't be. We know that. And not only that, you've got to think not about what happens to the people of the present generation, but how do you think your great-great-grandchildren are going to die if we normalise this?
All right, they're going to ring us out of the room. Margot, thanks so much. All right, thanks.